Good evening and welcome to the 2019 James Q. Wilson Lecture. Every year for 15 years, James Q. Wilson delivered an enormously influential lecture for the Manhattan Institute. He was a public intellectual without peer, and today, who better to honor his legacy than Edward Glaeser? Ed is the godfather of urban economics. He has transformed the study of the market dynamics of the world's great cities from an intellectual backwater to one of the most vibrant fields in the social sciences, all the while inspiring a growing number of protégés and practitioners around the country and the world. Everything you see around you today in the glittering, towering, often maddening cities we call home has at some point or another been quantified and chronicled across his more than 600 written articles and nearly 100,000 citations. Ed has been a friend of the Manhattan Institute and mine for many years now. He serves at Harvard as their Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics, and here at the Manhattan Institute as our Senior Fellow. His work is both stimulating and brilliantly clarifying. Look no further than our recent panel with Ed at South by Southwest, showing how artificial intelligence and computer vision can turn Google Street View's roving eyes into a real-time picture of urban change. But we're here with Ed tonight because, at the very moment of triumph for cities, something is amiss. In housing, jobs, and entrepreneurship, insiders appear to be favored at the expense of outsiders. And who are these outsiders and newcomers? The young, the immigrant, the new business, and the new hire. The future of our cities, and indeed our country, depends on how we open up these places of opportunity for all people and not preserve our cities in regulatory amber. As president of the Manhattan Institute, this is what I and our MI team think about every day. And we will do just that tonight with Ed. And so, without further ado, Ed Glaeser.
I cannot tell you how much I look forward to this lecture every year. This, for me, is coming home, and I view MI as my policy-related home. And I'm really delighted to have a chance to talk to you. I wish everything that I was going to say was just more upbeat than it currently is, but as always, I think there's always hope in a city. I think that for thousands of years, cities have been working miracles as they enabled people to learn from one another, to start new businesses, to create new polities, to create new art forms, and the age of miracles is not gone. It just needs better public policies, and it needs the type of policies and the type of leadership that MI can give it. So let me start. Let me start just to try and prove the timeliness. These were 3 headlines from today or yesterday that Rayan sent me. So this just reminds us of, this demon that we thought we had killed off in the 70s or 80s outside of New York, right? The evil of rent control, which is hard to think of a policy that's more shutting your door against newcomers who would come in. And yet, there California is proving their complete indifference to good policy making yet again, signing on a statewide deal on rent control. I cannot think of anything that sort of makes the point that we are at a moment in which we have accreted an ongoing set of rules that make it impossible for newcomers to come in and to find space. And just to make it sort of, make this thing even larger when we look forward, right? When you think about policies like universal basic income or many of the policies that are being pushed forward by Democratic candidates for the presidency, what they are offering the young is like a little soup soft cash. A little amount of money that says, we know that you're never going to have a proper seat at the table. We know you're never going to be part of creating something new in the economy, so we're just going to give you a check and let you not worry about it. And that is just a terrible vision for that generation, and that's a terrible vision for the future of America. So let me start where I was last year, and we have a series of highly disturbing polling data from younger Americans, from millennials. So 49.6% of younger Americans would prefer living in a socialist country. They're not necessarily clear what they mean by a socialist country here, but nonetheless, it's hard to view that as being positive. Same Harris poll in 2019 finds that 73.2% want universal health care, 76.1% favor tuition-free colleges. 50% of 18 to 29-year-olds favor larger government, as opposed to 42% who disagree. And yet, despite all of this seeming love for expanding the power of the state, only 34% say they trust their elected officials. You think they might actually have some recognition that these larger states actually have to be run by elected officials, but that doesn't seem to have worked. So only 34% say that they trust business leaders, and that's actually where the largest generational gap is between the young and the old. Now, when you face these numbers, is the right view that the young actually have a well-articulated, well-thought-out demand for a socialist system? Or is it that they just want something different? They just sense that something is wrong, and they want some sort of reshuffle on the deck. And I think there is at least some fraction of this, 73% or the 49.6% who just think the system seems stacked against them and want something different. And I think the key point that we need to make is that what they need is a system that is more free, not less free. We want a system that empowers them, that doesn't pay them off with a check and tells them to go away. So the argument of this lecture is that America is getting old as a country. Been a couple of centuries now, and as a country ages, it acquires powerful interests that privilege their members relative to outsiders. This process favors the old over the young, but also longer-term residents over new migrants, people who have rent-controlled apartments now rather than people who would like to rent an apartment sometime in the future, established companies over entrepreneurs, existing workers over new hires. The young understood that they're being shut out, and they want to reshuffle the deck. So socialism is not a new shuffle to them, just not a well-articulated plan. And we need to offer a better reshuffle. And that's, I think, what we have to grow for and move towards a world. And I think MI could not be better positioned to take the intellectual lead on this. We need to move towards a world in which it is understood that the right, that the friends of freedom are the ones who have new ideas that will actually benefit the young. Okay, so I'm taking as the spiritual guide on this actually Mancur Olson, whose work I read in graduate school, and I think I underappreciated at the time. And in fact, this argument about how societies accrete special interests, accrete regulations, is his argument. And it was an argument that he put in grand form about understanding the decline of nations as coming that over time they develop these rules which stymie the entrepreneurship, the new innovation that actually makes them great to begin with. So that's Mancur. And I'm just going to read you a couple of lines from his classic book on this. Stable societies with unchanged boundaries tend to accumulate more collusions and organizations for collective action over time. Unbalanced special interest organizations and collusions reduce efficiency and aggregate income in the societies in which they operate and make political life more divisive. Distributional coalitions slow down a society's capacity to adopt new technologies and to reallocate resources and respond to changing conditions and thereby reduce the rate of economic growth. Does this perhaps sound like any teachers' unions to you? I don't know. That's what I was reading. The accumulation of distributional coalitions, again, if you want to put in some form of union or whatever group you want for that cumbersome phrase of Mancur's, increases the complexity of regulation, the role of government, and the complexity of understandings, and changes the direction of social evolution. Put simply, this view is that a stable society sows the seeds of its own demise. And without some form of radical change to break open the barriers that make it increasingly difficult to move to start a new business, that we will look forward to a society that will constantly be looking over its shoulder and thinking that its best days are behind it. Okay, so Olson's example. So his first example was post-war Britain. Remember, he's writing in the early 80s before the revolutionary changes that Thatcher made became obvious. So, Great Britain, the major nation with the longest immunity from dictatorship, invasion, and revolution, has had this century a lower rate of growth than other large developed democracies. Britain has precisely the powerful network of special interest organizations, by which he meant both labor unions and aristocratic bastions of privilege, professional organizations. The term ungovernability was used when the Heath government fell as it attempted to assert the authority of the government at the time of the miners' strike. So Britain in the 70s, remember the winter of discontent, which this is an image of, right, seemed like it was a country that, despite being the most dynamic place on the planet in the late 18th century, was a place in which its age was long gone. Now, what he didn't understand is the nature of the English unwritten constitution is that Margaret Thatcher was unchecked in her ability, in a different way than a US president would be, to actually create radical change. And so they did manage to change this. Olson's second example was Tokugawa Japan, right, which, remember, for centuries was isolated from the world under the control of the shogun. Before Admiral Perry's gunboats appeared in 1854, the Japanese were virtually closed off from the international market. Protected markets enjoying a period of stability become cartelized. There were any number of powerful za or guilds, and the shogunate or the daimyo often strengthened them by selling them monopoly rights. Japanese guilds fixed prices, like rent control for you, restricted production, and controlled entry in essentially the same cartelistic organization elsewhere. Now, this is not his example, but it's mine, so I like Ken Oletta's book on this. I think 1970s New York feels an awful lot like this as well, right? America's oldest great city, it accretes an enormous amount of entrenched groups, both groups that are protecting tenants from possible rent increases, but also protecting public sector unions. Just remember how, Mike Quill just toasted John Lindsay when he actually wanted to do something tough in the 1960s. And, he feels a lot like Heath facing off against the British labor unions, increasing web of civic organizations which blocked change. Not all of that change was good, but in fact, these local organizations were increasingly making it difficult to change. And of course, in this case, New York changes around, but the change starts when, in fact, local autonomy is taken away. It starts with the Municipal Assistance Corporation. It starts when, in fact, local elected officials lose their ability to run the city. Further examples from Olson and elsewhere, right? The collapse of the Roman Republic is preceded by hardening class divisions. Think about the Gracchi, expansion of the grain dole, amassing military and political power for alliances like the Triumvirate, right? Again, sort of this organization has gone on too long and it's acquired too many of these coalitions that are making it very difficult to innovate. Ancien regime France is covered with rules and privileges that empower the aristocracy of both the robe and the sword, right? And of course, there's this amazing fact that no matter what change happens in France, the notaries, the notaires, always become more powerful. And I don't know why that is, why that's a rule of French history, but it is. Military change, political change, and even technological change since the rise of Silicon Valley can disrupt the collusions. And Olson claims that the healthy growth of Japan, Germany, and Korea post-war are due to the destruction of the pre-existing interest groups that had made it difficult to develop. Okay, now, my one communication with Manker was in 1992, I wrote a paper showing across America's metropolitan areas that places with lots of little businesses, places with lots of startups, grew much more than places with a few large companies. And this is a modern version of that fact. You can see employment growth 1977 to 2010 on average establishment size across metropolitan area. And what you can see here is that places with lots of little firms grow much more quickly than places that are dominated by a few large employers, right? So Manker saw this paper when it came out and wrote us a letter saying how great he thought it was and how it proved all his theories to be right, which was lovely to hear. Now, when I read this, I said to myself, all right, that's an interesting hypothesis. Maybe it's relevant for England, but we're Americans, right? We always have a new frontier. There's always something we can do new in the Sun Belt. We can, have new places where we aren't suffering from all these rules. We have checks and balances that make it possible to innovate. And yet, over the past 30 years, this country seems to have followed exactly the roadmap that Olson predicted, right? It feels over and over again in place after place. I mean, they're making it difficult to build in Texas, for goodness sakes. I never thought that would come about. So examples of this are, anti-development coalitions to protect incumbent homeowners, which means that the young look around themselves and they see, I can't ever hope to afford to buy in my parents' neighborhood, right? This housing market is completely stacked against me. And, if you're lucky to get an apartment, maybe they're okay, but they look and they see that, there's no apartments to rent either because rent control has made it unwise to build new rental housing. Occupational licensing and business regulations stymie startups and mobility across space, right? Together, these help explain a country that is becoming increasingly sclerotic across geographies. Job regulations, minimum wages protect insiders, often unionized, while outsiders either don't work or become contractors. Right? One not implausible view of our federal government is we have an old age pension system that is armed. That's at least one view of what our national government is. And I think the young look around them and they see a system that is rigged against them in 1,000 little ways. So let me give you some sort of examples about this. So this is the long history of the associations that block building. We have the Save Penn Station crowd in New York in the 1960s, which leads into this sort of large-scale historic preservation building. And just to give my usual caveat in that I'm the son of an architectural historian, right? I do, in fact, believe that many of New York's architectural treasures are worth saving. I just don't think that every glazed brick building on the Upper East Side is a historical treasure, okay? These associations use the language of preservation essentially to shut down building and to freeze their neighborhood as they were. Meaning, of course, that Greenwich Village, which was affordable when Jane Jacobs lived in it in the 1950s, now becomes a place where townhouses start at $7 million, and you have to be a hedge fund manager or an NYU professor to live there. The California equivalent, this is Clark Kerr's wife, and this is the Save the Bay Foundation. So in fact, the irony here is that from sort of a carbon emissions point of view, by far the lowest carbon emissions place in the world to build, in place in the US to build, is coastal California, right? That in fact the climate alone makes it incredibly positive to build there if you wanted to lower carbon emissions. And yet, California environmentalists have done an enormous amount to make it impossible to build there. And of course, when you don't build there, it's not, at least in the old days, it's not as if the building goes away, it just goes somewhere else. It goes in Oklahoma, it goes in Nevada, it goes in Texas. So, oddly, the environmental consequences of California environmentalists is at least arguably deeply negative. But they're one of these organizations that come out to essentially freeze their community, to give themselves the experience of living in what California felt like in 1965, 30 years later. Right? But the difference, the impact of that, of course, is that Berkeley isn't a place where you can come and buy a house anymore if you're a someone who's starting their life. This has only become more virulent. This is the anger at Airbnb. This is the anger at Uber. These are massive startups. Right? These are startups which, Uber is the one startup I know that Silicon Valley has produced that employs less skilled Americans, that actually deals with America's joblessness problem. Probably, most people in this room have used Uber at some point in time. It may deserve to go under because it can't compete, but it certainly deserves a shot to compete. And so does Airbnb. And yet the community rises up and tries to block it because it's not exactly what they want, because they feel empowered to say no to any form of change. This is the world that we've come to. And of course, the tragedy is that regulations accrete and are very rarely sunsetted. So what you're looking at here is just a fraction of communities with wetland, septic, subdivision, or cluster provisions in Massachusetts from 1975 onward. And the striking thing is that all of these numbers only go up. Right? You never have communities rolling things back. The regulations get on the book, and they stick there forever, saying no to a developer who wants to build in a certain way. Right? This is the nature of these rules, and they just make it harder and harder to force change. This is, of course, this is a figure that shows the relationship between building, between 2000 and 2013, and affordability. So affordability is measured as the gap between housing price and the marginal physical cost of construction. I should say that I started doing work of this nature at Manhattan Institute 15 years ago. So, and what this shows you is the places that build aren't expensive, and the places that are expensive are places that don't build. There's no repealing the laws of supply and demand, right? And yet, we have made it more difficult to build over and over again. And I really thought 10 years ago that there would never come a world in which I would actually have to worry about land use restrictions in Texas or land use restrictions in Atlanta. And yet, last year I was in Atlanta, this year I was in Texas. These things are on the agenda, Austin is regulating, and it's a genuine fear. We're losing those safety valves where people could go and actually be free of this web of regulations. And of course, the young have paid the price. So what you're looking at here is the net worth in housing in 1983 and 2013 by age. And I want to maybe focus on, let's say, the 70th percentile of 35 to 44-year-olds, and this is in real dollars. So the 75th percentile, meaning that 25% have more housing wealth, 75% have less housing wealth. In 1983, that person had in modern dollars $120,000 of housing wealth put away. Today, okay, that person has $58,000. Okay, so housing wealth for the young has gone radically down, while housing wealth for the old has gone up. There's been an intergenerational transfer by shutting down new construction. That means if you had a home, if you bought a home before the wave of building disappeared, then you did well. But for the young, they're sitting there picking up the crumbs, trying to get it at the edges. But the right answer for this is not universal basic income. The right answer for this is freedom. Right? The right answer for this is to allow people to use their property in the way that they want to use it. The groups that limit new building, the organization of neighborhoods organizations, the organization of civic agencies that are skilled primarily at saying no, also gives us an $18 billion big dig. Right? The big dig is the child of making it impossible to disturb anyone. And when Fred Salvucci, right, took on, during the Dukakis administration, the business of sinking the central artery and building a new connection to the airport, he was convinced that he had to do it in a way that didn't dislocate a single person, because he was upset that his mother, I think, had to move for a previous project. Now, it's not as if that goal isn't in some level laudable, but it's an awfully high price to pay for that goal. And if the world is one in which we have to spend $18 billion to do anything good for American infrastructure, that's a world in which we're not going to build a whole lot of infrastructure. It's a world in which America is going to be a static place instead of a dynamic place. The rise of occupational licensing. So this comes from the work of Kleiner, and it's updated by the National Center for State and Local Governments. And it shows the percentage of the workforce that had an occupational license in the 1950s was 4%. For much of the last 10 years, it's been over 20%. Okay? So America's gone from a place in which basically anyone can take on most jobs to a world in which vast numbers of occupations require a license, and that license is typically state-specific. So you can't just show up, right, in a particular state and think you want to engage in being an optician. So optician this is of course not the guy who actually checks your eyes. He's the guy who tells you whether or not those frames work well for you, sir. And may I say, they do in fact look quite well on you. But that skill is not one in which we actually think that we have a compelling public interest to actually protect people from people who are bad at telling you which shape of eyeglasses you need. And yet a large number of states in the country now in fact do require opticians to have state-specific licenses. I found this striking. So this comes from the World Bank's Doing Business report. And we do all right as a country on how easy it is to do business. This, of course, is a massive international data set which attempts to measure how easy it is to do business in the US and elsewhere. And some things we're really great at. We're third in the country on getting credit. In fact, you know, if you remember the Great Recession and all those bankruptcies, maybe we're a little too easy to get credit in. But we're number 3 in resolving insolvency. So that's a related skill. We do reasonably well in enforcing contracts. We're 16th in the world, 26th in the world at dealing with construction permits. I'm not sure how we managed to do that well on that one. But where are we globally on starting a new business? We're 53rd. We're way lower than other things about our system would make do. And that's showing you how America has moved from a place in which anyone could lay out a shingle and start a business to a world in which we make it increasingly difficult to build. Now, obviously, that's spatially dependent. New York is particularly terrible at this. But all throughout America, in an increasing number of places, it is not an easy thing to be an entrepreneur. And that is at least one possible explanation of why this has happened. So this shows the number of jobs which have been created by establishments less than 1 year old, starting from 1994 to 2015. And this is an astonishing decrease. In the 1990s, there were between 4 and 5 million jobs created every year by new establishments. Right? Over the last 10 years, it's never gotten above 3 million. Right? So we've lost a massive amount of the employment growth due to American, new establishment creation. And that's something that we should all be worried about. A decline of American dynamism, a decline of entrepreneurial innovation is something that should be absolutely terrifying to us. And I think it's something that the young see. They don't feel like they're in a place in which this constantly new hope of a new employer is going to provide them with an exciting new job in a field. They think to themselves instead that they are looking at a world in which they, the best they can hope for is universal basic income. I think these increasing regulatory barriers and, of course, the limitations on housing help to explain this phenomenon. So for 40 years prior to 1992, American interstate, inter-county migration never dropped below 6% a year, which means that 6% of American households moved across county lines every year. Right? That number has not been above 4% for any number of the past 12 years. Right? So we've had essentially a 1/3 decrease in the amount of migration in the US over the past 15 years. A huge change between a country which was always on the move to a country that's fixed. And at least for me, when I think about America's history, I think about a world in which we've always had different opportunities. But when farmers wanted to leave New England to go to the richer soil of the Ohio River Valley, there was no one who said they couldn't put up their balloon frame house there. Or when they wanted to move to tenements in 1890 in Manhattan, there was no one who said you couldn't build the tenement. Or if you wanted to move from Oklahoma to California during the New Deal, there was no one saying no to living in almost group quarters in California. Right? But now the new gold rush is in Silicon Valley. And good luck building an affordable home in Silicon Valley. Good luck moving there. This helps explain a series of other facts. So migrants no longer move to high-wage areas, particularly unskilled migrants. So throughout most of American history, you move from places that had low wages to places that have high wages. That's stopped, and that's due to the work of Denny Shoag and Peter Ganong. The change in the growth in the share of college degrees is positively correlated with the initial skills. So places that start with a skill advantage only become more skilled. And income convergence across space, so the phenomenon in which poor places in America have gotten richer, that is either stalled or vanished entirely. So I'll just show you 2 facts with this. So this is median income in 1980 on subsequent median income. This is essentially flat. Whereas the fact that my colleague Rabbit Barrow established was for 140 years, during this of American history, incomes converged sharply. Poor places grew more quickly than rich places in terms of income. The flip of this is that there is just a complete fixed nature of what parts of America are jobless. So here I'm looking at the share of prime-aged men who are not working in 1980 and relating this to the share of prime-aged men who are not working in 2010 across what are called public use microsample areas in the US. This relationship is extraordinarily tight. For those of you who are statistical on this, the R-squared is over 80%, and the coefficient is more than 1, meaning it's like an explosive process. So every bit you went up, you had more of an increase. Associated with this, I think, is also the fact that we have this rise of living wage laws throughout the US. So we haven't yet seen fully a massive increase in the minimum wage everywhere, but city after city is putting these fairly draconian floors on how low the wages can be. If you're not going to get a job because it's impossible to pay you a wage below the living wage in an area, why would you move there? And that's yet another potential barrier to mobility. And just in case, I've given you this before, but just in case you forget, minimum wages really do matter. They really do shut the young out of jobs. And this is Jeff Clemens' work, so he's looking specifically at younger workers and what the fraction is employed. And these are states that were previously below the federal minimum wage. These are the states that were not below the minimum wage. And you can see previously the employment rate was higher in the states that had a lower minimum wage, and that disappears once those gaps are closed by the increase in the federal minimum wage. Of course, we don't just have rules on employment that mandate wages. We also have a web of rules about benefits. And those things, you can see there, the share of benefits that are, the share of wages that are paid in the forms of benefits, those are sort of an unseen form of regulation that makes it more difficult to hire people as well. And instead of celebrating every entrepreneur who hires a younger, less skilled American, we're saying you have to do more. We're saying that you actually have to increase the cost of employment, and this is one of the ways we do it. And this is one of the reasons, because part-time workers often are freed from these regulations, that we've seen a move to a part-time employment economy. And that's what you're seeing here, is the rise of the amount of employment that's in part-time workers, supposedly for economic reasons. So instead of having a longer-term relationship with the employer that would require you to pay benefits, you're actually seeing people move in. And when young people see that they're only going to get a part-time job, it again is part of the sense that the system is stacked against them. This shows you across cohorts the joblessness rate for men. So this is people born 1940, 50, 60, 70, and born in 1980. This is the share that were not working. For most of their adult lives, almost 1 in 5 of the cohort born in 1980 have been jobless. Right? That is the impact of rules that make it difficult to hire them. Is that in fact they don't see a world in which 95% of them are actually going to be employed. They see a world in which 80% of them are going to be employed, and many of them who are employed are going to be in a not working, not so great job. They see a world in which one of the largest lobbying organization in the US is the AARP, right? 38 million members and a lockbox that guarantees that the money is not going to them, the money is going to somewhere else, right? And they feel that when they pay in for Social Security, they don't believe that they're going to get any part of that back. They yet again believe that the system is stacked against them. Medicaid, of course, is a huge part of the federal budget, the third largest mandatory spending program. And again, that's part of the sense that the federal government doesn't exist for them. It exists to take care of older people. It exists to take care of insiders. It exists to take care of anyone else other than them. This is from the work of Josh Rao. This shows the relationship between state pension liabilities and own revenues. So in the bottom of this, Wyoming only has pension liabilities that are 3 times their annual revenues. Alaska, which is at the top, is close to 30, okay? In the middle, you have Illinois and Ohio. Their pension liabilities are 6 times their annual revenues. So this is just what they owe to their older workers. Right? This is an astonishing example in which the state has directed its funds to its older entrenched workers, not to new people starting out. And I think every teacher who works in Illinois has got to realize that they're being paid a pittance, whereas the retirees are facing a very different experience. I think many of them also believe, this is the sort of thing that goes around, this is about dream hoarding, something that I've been accused of myself. So formal legal favoritism towards insiders accompanies informal ways in which insiders work the system. And the young complain about this as well. I think it's something that we should take much less seriously, but when you think about the things that bother them, it's a sense in which the insiders have figured out how to work the system. Not all of this is bad, right? Much of what they call dream hoarding, I call, taking care of my children or investing in education, and I think most of us as parents actually should do more of that, not less of that. So just to be clear where I stand on this. But I think we do need to worry that our private institutions are also, particularly if they're receiving federal grants for various things, they're actually doing a good job of taking care of the needs of the young as well. So I was intrigued by Olson when I first read him in the 1980s. I think this mass of rules and housing and employment, in the movement towards taking care of pensioned retirees rather than new workers, it just makes it feel more relevant than ever. His basic model that interest group growth leads to regulation, which leads to limited opportunity, seems more relevant than ever, and it can become a self-reinforcing downward spiral if young people see this and they respond, not by saying what we want is the opportunity to be great, but what we want is a handout. Right? That response is one that actually makes the system work worse, makes the system less productive. And as we look at a current political view where we have a sort of battle between, which feels like late 19th century Germany redux, between a bellicose nationalism and nascent socialism, right? This looks bad for the Friends of Freedom too. But I think the goal here is to make sure that we have a robust new freedom agenda that offers young people a sense in which America continues to be a place of opportunity and cities continue to be places where miracles happen. I think we actually need three movements, not one. And I believe this quite strongly. We need a political movement that is actually about winning elections. And that political movement has to take place in the current political environment, and as such, much of it may not do fantastically well with people who are 22. It may be too far away from there are, but we still need to win elections and we still need to have better policies today. We also need an intellectual movement. And of course, I've chosen Milton Friedman as my embodier of that. We need to have a case that is freed from the need to win elections, but that makes the case to the young that, in fact, freedom is the best ticket for them, that big government is not the answer, but rather an empowering environment is. And third, I think we also need a moral move of various kinds. It is important that young people learn that sense of satisfaction comes from doing, not from having. And that, in fact, one of the things that's wrong with socialism is not just that it's bad economics, but it's bad for the soul as well. And the problem is that people with PhDs in economics are not actually the right leaders of moral crusades. So I'm going to skip on from that, but let me say that I believe it is at least as important as everything else that goes on. The intellectual case, I think, is straightforward, right? Overmighty states are not, are engines for empowering insiders. Markets are not, right? Markets are about making things open for any entrepreneur. The Soviet Union's nomenclatura was an extreme example of insiders being taken care of by a large socialist state, but this is what socialist states do. Right? De Tocqueville's description of America in the 19th century shows what an open world occurs when you actually don't have regulations that stop new people from coming in. In some sense, the political agenda and the ideological agenda come together in the case for less regulation. I'm going to skip over those since I'm out of time, but I want to make 5 concrete points that are more policy points, and then I'm going to end with this. So first of all, I have been, on one level, so I've been talking about housing restrictions for about 18 years. One of the early events was actually held in this room. On one level, it's disturbing the fact that the wave of housing regulations have just gone up. On the other level, there is a movement. There's a Yimby Town movement, which is sort of an amazing thing. It's like, when you see a dog playing chess, you don't ask how it do against Bobby Fischer, right? You have a young movement of people who are actually fighting for yes in my backyard, fighting against regulations, and that is fantastic, right? That is just an absolutely fantastic thing. And my policy proposal to support them is much of these battles are happening in state legislatures. So I think anything that we can give the state activists to make their arguments stronger, and one of them is to actually tie federal highway funding to an environment that actually makes it possible to build. There's actually a logic to this. Why would you spend money on infrastructure in a place that's static, in a place that's fixed? Okay, I actually don't even think it makes sense to necessarily do this, but I want the people to be scared in the legislature. I want someone to be able to stand up in the California state legislature and say, "Oh boy, if we don't allow more permitting, they're going to cut our highway funds." Right? That's sort of it's the same strategy I take with scaring my kids. Right? So you raise threats that don't actually happen. Idea number 2. Right? Any new regulation has to be exposed to cost-benefit analysis. Right? We don't cost-benefit analysis any rules that we put on local government, and yet we've got tools, and that's the guy with the green lampshade over there. And also, why not have sunset clauses on most regulations? Why not actually require a positive need to repass the rule rather than it just persists forever? Right? If it persists forever, we know it's going to accrete. But if it ends after 5 years or 10 years, we know that at least it's going to be thought of again, and maybe we can require cost-benefit analysis then. Idea number 3, okay? I understand the anger over educational debt. I fully understand look, trust me, I understand as much as anyone in this room the failures of American higher education. I've lived it more than most of you have for the last 30 years of my life, okay? But the right answer is not to write off every student loan. The right answer is not to work to a world in which it's tuition free. But it is right, given how involved the government is with education, to push towards more marketable skills. It is right to, in fact, require educational institutions that get federal support to do a little bit of focus on whether or not people are actually going to be able to pay back the loans that they've been given. Idea number 4. This is my map of the geography of joblessness in the U.S. This is the sort of, the eastern heartland of the U.S. where joblessness is most extreme. So raise the retirement age for receiving Social Security. This is just about federal policy. And then one of the ways to encourage employment of the young is to reduce the payroll tax for the young. This was actually this was one of the parts of the Obama response to the recession that I actually really liked, was to make it easier for employers to actually hire people who were young, people who were lower wage, and to give them more encouragement for it. We want something that actually encourages people, particularly in the Eastern Heartland, to come up with new forms of employment for less skilled Americans. And when you think about what automation is going to do, I am confident that in New York City there will be entrepreneurs who will figure out how to find service sector jobs for anyone who is creative, wants to work, and is reasonably good at smiling with other people. Okay? I am not at all sure what happens in West Virginia, and I can think of nothing else other than encouraging employers to find their own entrepreneurial solutions for this. And reducing the payroll taxes is just a really natural way to do that. And finally, fighting against, in union contracts, particularly for public sector unions, fighting against the public sector rules that privilege the old over the young, and as my students Val Bolotny and Natalia Emanuel have shown, privilege men over women. When you have pension rules that say that whoever can work the most overtime in the last 3 years of jobs goes home with a bonanza, that's going to privilege men who can basically, and I'm speaking personally on this, who can basically ignore other family obligations to just rack up their hours, whereas women who are in their 50s often have real family obligations and aren't able to do this. So these are our rules, these are contracts that are not just ageist, meaning discriminating against the young, but also sexist as well, at least in effect, if not in intent. So these are just a set of ideas, but the larger point, is that the future comes from people who at one point in time are outsiders. The future comes from young people who didn't start with a job. It comes from new businesses that don't exist now. We have to recognize that this country and this city needs to be a place where outsiders can come and make it greater. And we need to understand that the forces that protect insiders have grown stronger over time, and that the young are watching and know it. And that if we don't provide a solution that's actually good, there are others who will provide a solution that isn't. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Do we have questions? I think we have like half an hour for questions. Yes, sir.
Wait for the microphone, please.
Yeah.
What is the plausible hope of passing anti-gerontocracy policies when the gerontocracy is growing as a percent of the population and participates in elections more than any other segment of the population?
Luckily, I'm part, by the way, let me just remind you which part of these 3 crusades I sit in. Just to be clear, I'm in this one, the middle one, okay? I don't actually win elections. I push for ideas. So that's my first response, is just to remember where I come from. Secondly, the goal here, in some sense, is to give the young hope and to convince them that there is, the people who are in favor of free markets are actually on their side, right? So that means you've got to make a good faith effort on this, even if you think the odds are low. Right? You've got to at least take a stand that says, look, we're actually about helping younger Americans, helping outsiders, even if you think that just the power of the AARP means it's not happening. So I think it's always worthwhile, I think, fighting for a cause that's just, even if you think the probabilities are low. I think there are areas in which, actually taming the full, the full welfare state's bias towards older Americans is impossible. Upping the retirement age is not impossible. It's been done in the past. It can be done in the future. Under pressure from solvency, I think that can and will be done. Reducing the payroll tax for the young is certainly plausible, reducing the payroll tax for all people. I think those are certainly possible things. So I think you have to, in terms of the political arm of this, you have to pick and choose your battles. But I think it's also really important to make it clear that the cause of freedom is not some outdated thing from the 1950s, that it is something that actually is for the young and will help them. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful talk. I'm going to limit my question to just 2 subjects. One is rent stabilization or rent control. New York recently changed, the Democrats took over the Senate, and so my first question on rent control is, with the new Supreme Court, we all know that current law says it's not a regulatory taking. You don't have to pay just compensation. I mean, there are many examples of very, very wealthy people paying like $2,000 a month for something worth $12 million. Is there a chance that the timing is now right for a new Supreme Court to basically say, this is a regulatory taking and you have to be compensated? And the second question relates to the regressive tax of minimum wage. Even liberal people have said the right solution is, because if you have a minimum wage, less people work. Let the market system work, and I think we're all free market people here, hopefully, but make up the difference in the earned income tax credit and bring them above maybe $15 an hour, because even that's not enough, but use the earned income tax credit to get rid of this regressive tax.
So I consider both of those comments deeply friendly amendments, and I agree strongly with them. Let me try and handle them both. So it amazes me that we have failed so much on rent control, particularly in California. The new law is the New York law is also quite shocking to me. I mean, getting rid of the income limitations. How in the world does that pass political muster? Actually, my favorite example, which I've used in an academic paper on rich people with great apartments, comes from Ken Auletta's book, and he tells the story of Nat Sherman, tobacconist to the world. Some of you may remember Nat Sherman's Fifth Avenue store from the old days, who tells the story of how he pays $200 for a Central Park West apartment, but he thinks it's fair because he uses it so rarely. Okay? So just to be clear on this, so it's not just that a rich person is getting a perk, but it's showing the incredible inefficiency of it. Because in fact, the point is there's someone else who would use it constantly and would love to have it and would be willing to pay a lot more than that. But it's, one of the terrible things about rent control is it misallocates apartments to people who are lucky enough to get it rather than people who are willing to use it. We also have abundant evidence that rent control causes a deterioration in the quality of housing. Many of us remember apartment buildings in the 1970s in the Upper West Side that had deteriorated under rent control. The work of David Otter and Parag Pathak on Cambridge when they got rid of rent control. And of course, the city of Cambridge would never have gotten rent control on itself. It was the state that got rid of it. There was not just an upgrading the physical quality of the rent control units, but the ones nearby got better too. The whole neighborhood improved when you got rid of rent control. This is just, this is a dragon that, it's such a terrible way to do anything that's positive in terms of redistribution. The original D. Gale Johnson paper on this from the 50s showed that actually landlords on average in New York were poorer than their tenants. Right? I'm not sure that that's universally true, but certainly when I was in graduate school, many of the sort of working class people who lived in Somerville and Cambridge and rented part of their triple deckers to the MIT economics graduate students that I was hanging out with were surely in any lifetime sense vastly poorer than the people that they were renting to. So it's sort of a terrible policy from almost any dimension. Now, what will the court do on this? I don't know. I doubt they're going to go full-fledged to regulatory taking on this, but there may be something in how they frame this law that can be toppled. So we'll have to see on that. So I'm not losing hope on this, although I really would have hoped that we could have won this through the actual, the political process rather than purely the regulatory process. Your second point was on the minimum wage, and I actually agree with you strongly. I am not at all against the idea of thinking about a creative way in which, poorer working Americans can earn more. The earned income tax credit has been a good policy for many decades. It happens to be a policy that doesn't work on the prime age jobless men because it's not at all targeted towards them. And you'd have to really radically think the EITC if you wanted to make that work. The idea of doing an employment subsidy basically through the payroll tax is another way of doing it. But in fact, I often say that I'm not against a minimum wage, as long as it's a higher minimum wage, as long as it's paid for by taxpayers, not imposed by businesses. And the vision, of course, is that the taxpayers are paying for it by the earned income tax credit. That in fact, whatever we want to do, we want to sort of encourage firms to create new workers, not tax those firms from creating new workers. And I think that's exactly the right way to go, is to do something that actually creates something that makes it sensible to work, sensible to open a new job opportunity, not one that actually says we're going to demonize you because you happen to employ less skilled Americans, or you happen to employ younger Americans. Other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, thank you for coming.
Thank you for being here. My name is Hank Salzauer. You covered an enormous amount of ground. One issue that you started off with, though, is the percentage of young people who would vote for socialism. I don't think that any place in this country you could, from K, never mind K through 12, and that's where it stops. I think it starts at K and it goes on to the end of college. There is probably no place that you could have delivered a lecture in the same manner that you delivered today and dealt with the facts. So we're educating a group of kids that the faculty is socialist and the end product is a socialist young graduate who really has not thought for himself, and the education has not enabled them to think.
Thank you. So there are a lot of things that are wrapped up in that. I will say that. So I spent a lot of time talking to undergraduates, and I will say I don't think it's quite as bleak as your portrait predicts. I mean, I think a lot of them manage to emerge, despite whatever indoctrination they've been put through, with a lot of ability to think on their own, with a lot of curiosity. And for many of them, at least the opinion polling shows, they don't really know. They don't describe socialism as being control of the means of production by the state. They think it means like a bit more redistribution. So I think it's bad, but I don't think it's a sense in which they've really all signed up for the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. Now, that being said, the leftward bias in many of our schools is still a real issue, and I agree totally with that. It is certainly true in both schools and in college campuses. One reason not to blame that too much for this is I don't think that has changed that much over the last 50 years. I mean, I certainly remember my teachers as being a fairly straight, a lot of nice things about Mao that you should think about. I mean, I sort of remember stuff like this in the 70s, which I managed to survive. But the children really have. I mean, so they really, their views on socialism really are very different from the kids who came of age in 1981 or 1982. So this is a problem to fight against, but it's not necessarily something that I can clearly point the arrow and say that causes this, although it certainly didn't work to prevent that. But let me just take a step back and say, one of the reasons why I particularly care about this cause is that, Milton Friedman was really two intellectual generations before me. I was a student of Gary Becker's, even a co-author of Gary Becker's, who was in some senses Milton's best student. So I'm two generations away from Milton, not one. But I really do feel that, whereas his generation of the economists who believed in freedom really did magnificently at winning hearts and minds for this, I feel like my generation is not. And I feel like in some sense, so let me take that blame on, that in fact, we have not managed to make this case. And this rise of socialism or the rise of rent control is a failure of us as educators, as people who actually teach a larger public that there are sensible ways to take care of poor people, and there are not sensible ways to take care of poor people, and these are not sensible ways to take care of poor people. So I think we are to blame, and we do need to retake the high ground of intellectual truth and make the case for freedom yet again and again in every generation. I've had tenure for 22 years at Harvard, and I have never heard in the economics department at Harvard someone's politics ever coming up, ever. Yes, sir.
One of the problems with the public sector unions being able to perpetuate a lot of the onerous benefits that they have, in some cases that really don't work in the public's interest, has been the Triborough Amendment to the Taylor Law. And attempts to turn that back and defeat it in the past have been, really unsuccessful because of the way that the public sector unions, have been able to organize themselves. Do you see any hope in this being changed at some point, or any legal ramifications that could change the outcome of that?
I tend not to think that. If legally meant the courts, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, and I shouldn't opine on it. Although I will say, in general, I tend not to be crazy about court-mandated solutions for things rather than actually winning public opinion on your side on it. I tend to think the pension area, which is an area that I've done work and written repeatedly, part of the problem with the pension problem is that these costs are very shrouded. They were repeatedly lied about. If you could realistically promise to earn 9% real returns annually, then you could pay for these pensions. But of course, that was illusory. And there's the added problem, which my wife, whenever I would write a column on this, she would remind me that, Ed, the three most mind-numbing words in the English language are unfunded pension liability, right? And your audience will not read past the first paragraph if you mention this. And this is a perpetual problem, is getting people to focus that this somewhat thorny, somewhat shrouded topic is something that in the long run is bankrupting states like Illinois, and is actually something that needs a lot of attention. So am I hopeful on this? I don't know. But I know it's something that we should still be fighting on, and it's something that we need to be pointing out. And in some sense, it's public sector unions are much less appealing than private sector unions are to ordinary people, because they sort of get the idea that there are these two different bargaining sides on the private sector and so forth. With public sector unions, in some sense, the problem starts that the public sector is electing the people who are supposed to bargain with them, right? So it's not some sort of fair arm's-length thing. And I think actually many younger Americans get that, and they get the fact that these union jobs are stacked against them. So I think I don't know how much hope to have, but I know it's a fight worth fighting.
The final question?
Okay. Okay, sure. Whatever you say.
You spoke about
Afterwards. We're on for afterwards, though.
You spoke about increasing retirement age. Do you think that would contribute to less opportunity for younger people in the workforce?
Look, I believe that the lump of labor fallacy is a fallacy. I think it just simply reduces it's the most palatable way to reduce the share of our national budget we send on Social Security, is to start the years when people receive those payments later rather than earlier. I am not in any sense taking, and I should have been clear on the slide, I have got no opinion on when private sector employers should do stuff. The Supreme Court has opined on this, but I have no views on that whatsoever. But the retirement age for Social Security and creeping it upwards is vastly easier than cutting benefits for reducing the expenditures on just politically. And so that's what I'm opining on. And I certainly don't believe that getting people in or out of the workforce makes any difference towards younger people. I think it is always a mistake, though, to think that there is like some aggregate number of jobs, and that many of the times, many of the cases that it's older workers who actually are going to be the entrepreneurs who are going to provide employment for younger workers. So there is, in fact, in a real sense, a synergy between the old and the young. It's just through this sort of political battle that they've become poised as enemies. But in fact, in reality, in economic reality, the old and the young are allies, not enemies. And I think that needs to come out again. And that's true, by the way, and maybe that's a good place to end. That's true more generally. That's one of the happiest differences between a world of markets and a world of public rules about redistribution. In a world about markets, most people that you meet are people that you could buy from or sell from or employ or get a job from. They're your allies most of the time, right? In a world in which we're all just fighting over the same political pie, they're likely to be your enemy, right? That is a deep illness about having a world that has become like Manker Olson's world, a world in which we have interest groups that are battling over a limited amount of tax revenues. And it's just so different from a world that says the future is one that we make, and we make it together. And we make it by coming up with ideas together and by doing things together. And that ultimately is what we're all fighting for, is the freedom to create something collaboratively as a country and as a city. So let me end with that, and thank you very much for your time.